Hello everyone and welcome to the second in our series of the Bookcase Presents online events. Today we welcome Mike Wilson, who's the education coordinator for the WEA, and today Mike's going to talk to us about the Poets Laureate, the history of them and the role as it is today. He's always been a very popular speaker at our events here, and I'm sure will be known to many of you, and so we welcome you, Mike, today.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Okay, so my subtitle for this was The Dubious History of the Poets Laureate. A friend of mine used to work as a writer in residence in a prison. This meant going in regularly and working with a select few inmates on a range of writing tasks and exercises. But he also found that he was in demand by a wider prison community, not necessarily committed to creative writing as a pastime. And they would approach him at various times in the year and ask if he could help them write something to send in a card to their kids at Christmas or to their girlfriend on her birthday. It was as if something drew them to poetry as a primal form of human expression at these key times in their lives. Even these men, these prison residents, they're semi-literate perhaps, literature resistant in the main perhaps, for sure. Those whose everyday lives have never included Poetry Please on Radio 4 maybe, have never gone into the Bookcase or into Waterstones and come out with a book called 101 Poems to see you through your day. Even prison inmates were feeling the need to turn to poetry to mark those special moments, the highs and the low points of their lives. And it seems that monarchs are no different. In this talk we'll examine how monarchs too have felt the need for exalted words to bring stature and majesty, pomp and ceremony to mark the big occasion. In the early days, the royal poet was appointed in much the same way as royal composers were appointed, to mark the occasion with memorable music for memorable occasions. Think of Handel's coronation anthems like Zadok the Priest. Think of Handel's water music. Think of Mozart's Requiem. There's something also here to think about, which is that word commemorate, to co-remember, to remember together, to bring a sense of community, of communality to the great occasions, the milestones of these prominent lives and deaths. By the 21st century, by today, the laureateship has had a checkered career, shall we say, and we'll examine some of this and explore some of the highs and lows of the job. Andrew Motion famously said that he wanted to give up the post so that he could get back to writing, to get back to enjoying writing. No other writing, he has said, of any kind has been so difficult. Some writers would say that the best way to trigger writer's block is to be obliged to write on a certain subject in a certain style, on demand, to a certain deadline, subject to official approval and public approval. For some, this is the death of creativity. This is the death of inspiration. Who was it said that the poet's job is to make language fresh and new and startling even? Well, quite a few poets have actually. Ezra Pound said it to T.S. Eliot. Kenneth Koch, the American writer, said this many times and wrote poems on that very theme, lectured on that theme. Craig Raine and the Martian poets were very much into this. But all poetry should aspire to a state of enlivened discourse, perhaps, yeah, such that language might seem trembling with life and originality. Avoiding contrivance and cliché is what all poets are aiming to do all of the time, you'd think, to get past the overblown, the overused, the over-familiar language of the everyday to something that is, or tries to be, or at least seems to be, more authentic. But how do you avoid repetition? How do you find something fresh and original and authentic to say about yet another Queen Mother's birthday? Queens and Queen Mothers may not actually be 400 years old, it just feels that way sometimes. Writers have been charged with the task of trying to find fresh new eulogies, ways of saying the same cheerful thing about the same sorts of royal occasions for about that long, about 400 years. Actually, of course, when you stop and think about it, until relatively recently, the Poet Laureate's job has never really been that much about the poetry, any more than the Eurovision Song Contest is all about the music. The dubious history of the Poets Laureate has far more to do with politics than it has to do with literature, certainly in the early days. It began very much as a blatantly political appointment. In 1668, Charles II appointed John Dryden as the first official Poet Laureate, with reference to Ben Jonson and the now forgotten Sir William Davenant, who were given unofficial jobs in this sphere before then. And Charles II's idea was that the Poet Laureate would promote the Catholic cause in English life and politics. It was the Poet Laureate's job to discredit the King's enemies, the Earl of Shaftesbury and the Duke of Monmouth, and criticise them he did, through a series of thinly disguised invectives in verse, all for an annual allowance of £100 per year, plus another 100 to act as court historian, or what they called then a court historiographer. You can see there the intermingling of art and politics. You're not there to write poetry, my lad. As such, you're there to write political polemic. You're there to rephrase history in the service of the man currently in power. Incidentally, you might be working out whether £200 a year was a decent living in those days, just for banging out a few poems. Well, in 1730 or so, the royal barber earned around £170 a year. Although you may imagine that as the royal haircutter, he might have been called into service rather more frequently than the royal poet was.
And what's the salary now, Mike?
Oh, good question. It sort of changed a bit during the 20th century, didn't it? It was something like, one person said, forget the £17 a year, and I'll stick with the case of sherry, or the butt of the butt of
the butt of sack, or the butt of
it was a butt of canary, butt of canary, which is a sweet white wine. I think, isn't it that Simon Armitage has just done a recent programme on Radio 4 where he's invited people to his garden shed during lockdown, and they've had a nice little bit of a glass of wine.
Laureate wine, yes.
Chewed the fat over a glass of Laureate wine.
Excellent.
Yeah. But yeah, okay. In a long career, Dryden had written in praise of Charles I, and then after his death, Dryden lamented the death of Oliver Cromwell during the interregnum. And then he wrote in favour, once again, of Charles II and James II when the monarchy was restored. But with the accession of William of Orange in 1688, the poet, who had seen fit to repudiate his Anabaptist upbringing, to become a Catholic in order to secure a position at Charles's Catholic court, was not given the opportunity to change his mind back again and go back to being a Protestant, when royal favour had swung back the other way. He was replaced in 1689 by Thomas Shadwell, a loyal Protestant and no friend of Dryden's either, who went on to shower dutiful praise on his paymaster, the new king. It's hard to tell whether Dryden was more annoyed that he'd lost his £200 a year, or that he'd been replaced by Shadwell, his religious opposite, his political opponent, and his literary rival. It was Thomas Shadwell who first established the practice of a regular, repeatable sequence of odes, in which in years to come would prove such a burden to some of his successors. A poem to His Majesty on New Year's Day, 1690, followed by more or less the same poem on more or less the same theme a year later. New Year's Day, 1691, and so on. And for Queen Mary's birthday, 1691. Interestingly, another theme establishes itself really early on, and Eve and I were talking about this before we started. On His Majesty's conquests in Ireland, 1692. And we'll come back to more poems about military exploits later on. We should note that most of the prominent appointees to this job, certainly for the first 200 years or so, were not renowned at the time for their poetry at all. A fair few Poets Laureate appear in various anthologies of bad verse, the world's worst poetry, and this famous anthology called The Stuffed Owl, which I shall read from in a while. Quite a lot of them unashamedly, unabashed, seem to appear with no sense of shame in collections of the world's worst poetry, which is interesting. There's an example here from Thomas Shadwell, who I've just mentioned. This is his Queen Mary's birthday, 1691, and I'll just read you a bit of this so you get the flavour of it. There's quite a lot. It goes on. Welcome, welcome, glorious morn. Nature smiles at thy return. At thy return the joyful earth renews the blessings of Maria's birth. The busy sun prolongs his race, the youthful year his earliest tribute pays, and frosts the forsake his head and tears his face. Welcome, welcome, glorious morn. Nature smiles at thy return, for nature's richest prize with thee was born. You get the flavour and you get the feel for, you know, the kind of thing that was thought useful at the time. Nahum Tate, who replaced Shadwell, the glorious name, Nahum Tate. I'll read you some of a flavour of some of his poems. Virtue is at last regarded, and the hero's toils rewarded. Hark how the neighbouring nations round to Britain's echoed mirth resound, and various languages employ to speak the universal joy. The promised year is now arrived, that the golden age revived. Come, goddess of the spring, appear with wreaths of ever-smiling flowers, gathered from Elysian bowers to crown the day that crowns the year. Arise, harmonious powers, from your Elysian bowers, and nymphs Heliconian springs to caress the royal day, that such a blessing did convey, no less a blessing than the best of kings. Now, you get a flavour there for the kind of thing that feels much of a muchness. All of those Nahum Tate bits that I quoted, there are actually 2 lines here and 4 lines there from 4 separate works which were 18 years apart. So you can see he was churning them out on a production line. All those Elysian bowers, those were actually 12 years apart. You must have thought perhaps that he must have hoped that the audience would have forgotten that he'd already used that phrase a few years earlier on, because it comes up quite a lot.
I think it's probably quite like it that time. It's not as if people were reading newspaper reviews and cutting them out and keeping them, is it? You know, so I suspect he would get away with it at that time.
Yeah. But it sort of speaks for perhaps 200 to 300 years of enforced jollity and tenacious praise of the monarch that was represented by what was required. To be fair to these early poet laureates, most of them, none of them really were actually poets in their own right, in any sense that we would understand today. They were prominent dramatists and theatre impresarios who were drafted in to do pomp and ceremony. They were pageant merchants. And you can see by the layout of many of the verses that they produce that they have this kind of call and response format with separate parts for solo recitativo, chorus, air, antiphon, such as a grand pageant or a religious ceremony might have had. Ted Hughes in the 20th century returned to this format for some of his laureate poems. In a letter he called them, the verses you might write as for a masque, M-A-S-Q-U-E, or for a drama. Nahum Tate, who had succeeded Shadwell, is not now famous for his time as a poet laureate. He's also not remembered nowadays for his suggested improvements to Shakespeare's King Lear, including the happy ending that he added for a theatre production. Nor is he remembered for his A Poetical History of Syphilis, the French disease. Not remembered for these at all.
We actually have someone here who's done a lot of research into Napoleon, and apparently that was very relevant.
Oh, okay. I'm sure
Without
it was.
saying any more.
Yeah. But in my researches, I didn't quite get to reading the whole of his poetical works. If he's remembered at all, it's because Nahum Tate provided the words to a couple of enduring musical works. Now, this is where I would normally turn to the audience and say, OK, so come on, have a guess. What did Nahum Tate write that you've all heard of and you all know? While Shepherds Watch Their Flocks by Night.
Yes.
That's the work of a poet laureate, believe it or not. That's one of his. And the libretto for Purcell's Dido and Aeneas, including the sumptuously beautiful Dido's lament. When I am laid in earth, may my wrongs create no trouble in thy breast, and so on. Remember me. Now, if you know that story, you know that it's just an incredibly emotional moment in the piece. But the words on their own are actually rather flat, and there's not a lot of resounding words in there that, you know, it really needs the music to lift it out of the ordinary. So there's a discussion to be had here about what makes a writer a poet as distinct from a lyricist or a dramatist or a political polemicist or a publicist or a self-publicist. The job has morphed over the years, and it's only in recent years that it's become valuable to us, the readers perhaps, and that the job, it actually involves poetry at all. So the Poet Laureate does not perhaps, the job does not require the talents of the best poet of each particular age, any more than the Eurovision Song Contest would benefit from employing the best musicians of the age. The splendidly named Colley Cibber became laureate in 1730. And he held the post for 27 years, and this book I've been referring to, this guy Nick Russell, writing about the Poets Laureate up until Betjeman's time. He records that Colley Cibber merrily was turning out odes for all those 27 years, turning out odes with the minimum waste of time and effort. Alexander Pope called Colley Cibber the Prince of Dullness, but Cibber was not offended. He wrote, "No man worthy of the name of an author is a more faulty writer than myself. That I am not master of my own language, I too often feel when I am at a loss for expression." It was Alexander Pope who coined the phrase "damned with faint praise," and this is a worthy summary of much of the critical response to many of the early poets. I'm going to jump forward a little way here and go to Robert Southey, who was a laureate between 1813 and 1843. He famously had ongoing spats and arguments with Byron. For some reason, Byron was never considered for the job of Poet Laureate.
Being mad, bad and dangerous to know, probably,
being mad,
yes.
bad and dangerous to know. And being abroad
Of
for one
course.
thing. Byron called Southey Dry Bob, Robert. Dry Bob, which was a sly reference to his sexual shortcomings as much as his limitations as a poet. Insults flew back and forth between them, many of Byron's being so outrageous and libellous that it was suggested that one reason for him fleeing to the continent and staying there was that he feared he'd be taken to court for libel if he ever returned to England. An example. Southey wrote a sycophantic ode on the death of King George III, which is called The Vision of Judgment. And I'll read you a bit of it from here. And Byron took exception to it. Robert Southey wrote, "Lift up your heads, ye gates, ye pearly gates, and ye everlasting portals, be ye lift up. For lo, a glorified monarch approacheth, one who in righteousness reigned and religiously governed his people. Who are these that await him within?" And a procession of great kings of England come and meet him at the pearly gates. And this was Robert Southey's rather sycophantic version. Byron wrote a scathing satirical response, also called The Vision of Judgment, in which it's Southey himself who dies and goes to heaven. There is a pause at the pearly gates whilst St. Peter and the devil, the choirs of heaven and the satanic hordes all compete and argue for possession of Southey's soul. And it's touch and go whether he goes to heaven or to hell in Byron's scurrilous satirical poem. But the moment that Southey starts to read one of his poems, the heavenly hordes scatter and they all say, "No, God, no, shut up, stop, you have him, no, you have him, let him into heaven, no, you have him in hell." And this is Byron's approach to the way that Southey wrote his poems.
I have to say, I can quite understand that. I had a quick look thinking 1815 Waterloo, there must have been a Poet Laureate poem about that. It's 55 stanzas long. I didn't really bother, I'm afraid.
Exactly. Byron's prose introduction to his poem begins, "It has been wisely said that one fool makes many, and it hath been poetically observed that fools rush in where angels fear to tread." This is Byron quoting Pope again. If Mr. Southey had not rushed in where he had no business and where he never was before and never will be again, then the following poem would not have been written. It's not impossible that my poem may be as good as his own, seeing that it cannot by any species of stupidity be worse. Even Southey's friends and admirers damned him with faint praise. Oh, his prose is perfect. Of his poetry there are various opinions. There is perhaps too much of it. He has passages equal to anything. This reminds me of John Betjeman's comments when he became Poet Laureate in October 1972. He said to the newspapers, "I am pleased to be the successor in this position of my friend Mr. Cecil Day-Lewis. I am also pleased to be the successor of Tennyson, Wordsworth and Bridges, but not quite so pleased to be the successor of Alfred Austin. I am sure he wrote some good poetry. I have been reading his work, looking for it." So why single out Alfred Austin with such a caustic remark? It seems uncharacteristic of Betjeman somehow. The 19th century had seen a change in the character and the calibre of the poets appointed. There had been Tennyson, Wordsworth, as Betjeman had noted, but with Alfred Austin a familiar pattern was revisited. He was a political appointment. He was a regular contributor to the conservative newspaper, the London Standard. He was a journalist and with no real poetical credentials to speak of. 11 days after being appointed in 1896, he was the centre of a political storm and scandal, the like of which has not really afflicted any other Poet Laureate before or since. There have been plenty of literary controversies, but no major political ones, certainly not on this scale. The newspapers which reported the appointment of Alfred Austin to the Poet Laureate role also carried the first early reports of the infamous Jameson raid in South Africa. This was an illegal incursion planned in secret by Cecil Rhodes, the Premier of Cape Colony, and carried out by Dr. Jameson, the British administrator of Southern Rhodesia. The plan was to burst secretly into the Transvaal with 500 British troops on horseback to create unrest and to challenge the government of the Boer administration. But the bungled operation fell apart after a few days and the troops were forced to surrender. It was an ignominious defeat for the British Empire, which embarrassed the British government and annoyed Queen Victoria. The Germans sent a message of congratulation to the Boers. Cecil Rhodes was forced to resign. Jameson was tried and sentenced to 15 months in jail. The whole sorry controversy, which had a direct influence on the slide towards the Second Boer War. So what is a loyal Poet Laureate to do? How can he record and celebrate the vainglorious spirit of the age when the age is scandalised, less than glorious, actually, rather shameful? So this is what he did. He wrote a poem called Jameson's Ride. Not Jameson's Raid, but Jameson's Ride. And you can kind of see what he did there, yeah? Jameson's Ride instead of Jameson's Raid. And it starts like this. Wrong? Is it wrong? Well, maybe. But I'm going, boys, all the same. Do they think me a burgher's baby to be scared by a scolding name? They may argue and prate and order, go tell them to save their breath, then over the Transvaal border and gallop for life or death. Let lawyers and statesmen addle their pates over points of law. If sound be our sword and our saddle and gun gear, who cares one straw? When men of our own blood pray us to ride to their kinsfolk's aid, not heaven itself shall stay us from the rescue they call a raid. It went on in unrepentant mode like that for several more stanzas. He was a bit gung-ho about this, although he did cut some roses from his garden and send them to Queen Victoria to try and appease and mollify her a little bit, because she was publicly upset by the Poet Laureate stepping out in this way. This might remind us a little bit of a few years earlier Tennyson's famous Charge of the Light Brigade, another poem written by a presiding Poet Laureate, which celebrated another military blunder. This time You'll know that it's Into the Valley of Death rode the noble 600. He did thread into there somewhere the line about theirs not to do or die, even though they knew someone had blundered, and he rhymed blundered with 100. And so the Poet Laureate was making a kind of nuanced criticism of what had been going on, but what we remember now, of course, is the sturdy bravery of the noble 600. I'm reminded of the phrase lions led by donkeys, those memorable words from the First World War. So what did Robert Bridges, the Poet Laureate, during that conflict make of his job during the First World War? Well, here's a poem that he wrote to mark, this was I think 1917 he wrote this, and I'll read the first bit of this. It's called The West Front. No country know I so well as this landscape of hell. Why bring you to my pain these shadows, effigies of barbed wire, riven trees, this corpse-strewn, blasted plain? And again, I'll just read you a sample of that. You can see here that he's really channeling into that kind of, it's worthy of Wilfred Owen. He's got that sort of the pity of war, the pathos of war that was very much Wilfred Owen's territory. But the official Poet Laureate was able to use the same kind of phrases and the same kind of emotion. He also, incidentally, wrote a poem welcoming the United States of America into the war. It's an interesting poem from 1917 that he wrote as an official welcome from the British Crown to the United States of America. Brothers in blood, they who this wrong began to wreck our Commonwealth will rue the day when first they challenged free men to the fray, and with the Briton dared the American. So on. Again, I'll to keep these brief, there's more of that one as well. But it's interesting that this idea of America being threaded into our national discourse starts quite early there, really. John Masefield, who succeeded Robert Bridges in 1930, is now best known for his sea poems. There's two sea poems of his which appear in the nation's favourite poems collection, available in all good bookshops. Sea Fever, I must down to the seas again, to the lonely seas and the sky, and Cargoes, which starts with that fantastic line, Quinquereme of Nineveh. It's just such a brilliant, anyway, very evocative, and he never actually worked at sea. He went to sea once and had to turn back because he got seasick and came back to Britain. Anyway, one of his early laureate works is a seafaring poem of a sort. It's called, enigmatically, 534. And this is the works number of the ocean liner Queen Mary, which was launched from the Clyde in 1934. And he wrote a poem welcoming, and it's great. It's almost, you could feel the relief that we don't have to write just about Queen Mother's birthdays and Happy Birthday King and all this kind of. He writes, it's just such a brilliant image that he starts with. He's talking about the mining the resources from the earth and making this majestic emblem of empire, this magnificent huge ship. 534. For ages you were rock, far below light, crushed without shape, earth's unregarded bone. Then man, in all the marvel of his might, quarried you out and burned you from the stone. Then being pured to essence, you were naught but weight and hardness, body without nerve. Then man, in all the marvel of his thought, smithed you into form of leap and curve, and took you so and bent you to his vast, intense, great world of passionate design, curve after changing, curving, braced and massed to stand all tumult that can tumble brine, and left you, this a rampart of a ship, long as a street and lofty as a tower, ready to glide in thunder from the slip and shear the water with majesty of power. It's brilliant. It's the best one so far in my book, you know. You'd have to say that Masefield had a busy time of it, being the the Poet Laureate between 1930 and 1967. So he began with a tribute to King George V when he died in 1930, a welcome to Edward VIII, of course, a welcome to George VI in 1936 following the abdication, a prescient well-wishing to Princess Elizabeth in 1952. He actually wrote a poem of farewell as she set off on her tour of the Commonwealth in 1952. How did he know to end his poem? May all the weathers of your way be fair, and a safe returning crown your journey done. He couldn't have known when he wrote it and published it as she set off on her journey that she would be called back from Kenya prematurely to assume the crown. And a safe returning crown your journey done. So she came back to assume the crown following the death of her father. He'd begun to diversify a little bit the things that he could write about. So for instance, he wrote tributes on the death of John F. Kennedy in 1963, the American theme coming in again, and on the death of T.S. Eliot, naturalised Britain, but American poet again, in 1965. So you can see that the subject matter of laureate poems was beginning to diversify and continuing to diversify. Cecil Day Lewis, who we've already mentioned, was commissioned to write a poem for the Battle of Britain, but not for the World War II battle itself in 1940, but for the release of the film The Battle of Britain in 1969. It was read out in Leicester Square on the opening night of the movie itself. So it's bizarre. I mean, he also wrote a poem on the subject of shipbuilding called Hail Teesside, which is an interesting one. And then a poem which was a contribution towards the I'm Backing Britain campaign of 1968. I remember the I'm Backing Britain campaign. He wrote a poem called Then and Now, which again has all of the pomp and ceremony of a royal occasion, but it was actually just for a marketing campaign, essentially, for British trade and industry. To work, then, islanders, as men and women, members one of another, looking beyond mean rules and rivalries towards the dream that you could make real of glory, commonwealth and home. Sir John Betjeman succeeded C. Day Lewis, and he was a well-known figure on radio and television already before he became poet. He was an advocate for the preservation of England, its architecture, its heritage and the English countryside. So the job of Poet Laureate had begun to be something more again. This was already a public figure that the public knew and loved and related to. He was what they would now call a shoe-in for the job of Poet Laureate, because his poetry, because of his public persona, but also because his poetry was light, very rhythmic, very accessible poetry, as well as the traditional encomiums for the royal birthdays and weddings. He wrote something for the Princess Anne's wedding to Captain Mark Phillips. I wonder what happened there. And to Prince Charles's wedding to Lady Diana Spencer. I wonder what happened there. His stock in trade was always those mildly, affectionately satirical pinpricks against a certain ritual, English, gentility. And you just got to love them, they're just so nice. I'll quote 4 lines from one of his many poems. Phone for the fish knives, Norman, as cook is a little unnerved. You kiddies have crumpled the serviettes, and I must have things daintily served. So he was a natural to take on this job of saying rather cosy things about the Queen's Silver Jubilee, for instance. And again, the newspapers had started actually kind of being rather critical, which feels a bit unfair. It's okay for Byron or a rival poet to say something, but for the newspapers to say. In days of disillusion, however low we've been, to fire us and inspire us, God gave to us our Queen. She exceeded young and dutiful to a much-loved father's throne, serene and kind and beautiful, she holds us as her own. And 25 years later, so sure her reign has been, that our great events are greater for the presence of our Queen. And, okay, you can see what the newspapers were getting at. Betjeman was rather stung by the criticisms, and he said, well, look, this was meant for singing. He's pitched these words for, again, another sort of cathedral occasion. God Save the Queen, he said, is not poetry. My poem was meant for singing. God Save the Queen is not poetry, but it sings well. Dido and Aeneas, Dido's Lament, is not poetry, but it sings well. This was written to sing well, he said. So there's something also going on here, back to that idea that what is a lyric and what is a poem. Again, we're coming almost full circle back to songs of praise perhaps, words that are passable as lyrics, but impossible as poems. Times were changing, of course. Newspapers mocked Betjeman and prompted that self-justification. We were becoming a much less deferential nation than we used to be. It makes the laureate's task even harder. Andrew Motion had written about how difficult it was to balance the expectations of the job, and I'll quote something from what he said after the event. The problem is partly to do with the subjects of these poems. Subjects being a nice pun on the few people in the country who are not subjects because they're the monarchy. The problem is partly to do with the subjects. How was I to connect with them, knowing only what the newspapers tell me? How was I to steer an appropriate course between familiarity, which would seem presumptuous with my majesty, and sycophancy, which would seem absurd? And how was I to weigh and value them, knowing that a large part of the population doesn't want there to be a royal family or feels indifferent to it? It's this spirit that has continued the drift away from the songs of praise mode and shifted the role to something more demotic and democratic in recent years. More recent poets laureate have no longer fulfilled the role of the king's poet, but aspire much more often, much more frequently, to be the people's poet. So the more recent contemporary laureates, Andrew Motion and then Carol Ann Duffy, had broadened the scope of the subject matter to include not kings but subjects. Both of them wrote poems, very moving poems, about Henry Allingham and Harry Patch, the two last oldest men to have fought in and survived the First World War. Carol Ann Duffy, the first woman to be awarded the honour, and the only lesbian so far, also contributed poems about the 2008 banking crisis, the sleaze scandals of MPs' expenses, climate change, the eruption of the Icelandic volcano Eyjafjallajökull, and the subsequent quieting of the skies that triggered. But also she's written about gay pride and, memorably, David Beckham's injured ankle and its effects on the England football team's fortunes in the European Championships that year. The current incumbent, Simon Armitage, has written an ode to a clothes peg. It's not quite as downbeat as it seems. This is a homage to Keats, an ode to a Grecian urn and others. Simon Armitage has also commemorated cancer treatment. He's marked the anniversary of the 1969 moon landings, the anniversary of the Royal Astronomical Society and Mental Health Awareness Week. He's marked 70 years since the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act. He's commemorated COVID-19. I'll come back to Simon Armitage in a second, but I'm going to just make some general comments to close with, and then perhaps to hand back to Eve. State of the art of poetry that we started with. Poetry works best when it has something indefinable and timeless, some kind of universal quality. That's what the poets are striving for. They may be focusing on one small, specific image, one little simple metaphor, a glimpse, but a minor moment that actually unpacks and speaks for a wider human experience. It's a small window that opens up onto a vast landscape. A psychogeography, as they would say nowadays. There's a glorious little short poem about 8 lines long or something Adrian Mitchell wrote called Beatty is 6. A 6-year-old girl holds her grandpa's hand as she starts to walk down some stairs, and he wishes the stairs would last forever. It gets me every time. The whole human experience of life and death and the transience of both, generations, it's all captured in that one fleeting, fragile image. But the poet is aiming to make a message that is timeless and true. It's something we can all relate to, some connection to this universal human truth that will chime and echo and endure in the hearts and souls and imaginations of parents, daughters, grandparents, granddaughters. The main problem with so much laureate poetry is that it isn't striving for something timeless and true at all. It's very much pinned and restricted to its own little moment in time, certainly the early stuff. It's the verse equivalent of a newspaper headline or a birthday card. It's a point in time. It's the humorous topical song from the Esther Ranson That's Life show. It's the humorous topical song from Radio 4's The Now show. It's ephemeral. It's not built to last. Those well-wishing birthday card verses penned in 1692 by Shadwell feel forced and ephemeral now, and as we have seen, they've proved indistinguishable from and interchangeable with the well-wishing birthday card verses of 1693 and of 1793 or 1973. These days, the Poet Laureate's job has a 10-year tenure. So in the next 10 years, there will be something momentous. There will be some momentous occasions for Simon Armitage to write about. So it will be interesting to see what challenges he faces and what poems come out of his imagination to mark those milestones for us. Will he be called upon to say a fond farewell to our longest serving monarch? Will he be penning a welcome to a new king at some point before he hands on the baton in 7 or 8 years' time now? Will there be a final poem of farewell to the European Union when we finally get Brexit done? There aren't many words that rhyme with Brexit, I've found, to my cost. Will there be a welcoming paean, a welcome poem to President Trump's second term in office in the next few months? Or will COVID-19 dominate his output for all the years to come? What fresh, new, original, trembling, vibrant words will he find to encapsulate the enduring sameness of the human experience of lockdown? Only time will tell. But, to paraphrase Byron, it is possible that Mr. Armitage's next poems may be as good as those of his predecessors, seeing that they could not by any species of stupidity be any worse. Thank you.
Mike, thank you very much indeed. That's been a real romp through the history of the Poets Laureate.
Yeah, we covered some ground, didn't we?
Yes, and it is quite fun actually to poke fun at them, I think, you know, with all these sort of centuries in between us. I mean, the one question that leaves for me is, has the post become too archaic to be useful for the future? Because, you know, as some other poets have said, it does dent their creativity. It can't be easy, but you know, you've given us a wonderful insight there into, say, the poets old and new, and long may they continue, so that we can at least look back and have a giggle.
Certainly, absolutely.
But thank you so much. It's been tremendous to hear that talk this afternoon, and our thanks to Michael Dobbs from Woodborough, who's videoed this for us, and we hope you'll watch future online talks from the Bookcase in the coming weeks. Thank you.